Clear. Keep pushing. Fire! Hit the deck!
What does it actually look like when one soldier decides an entire village is his personal mission? What would you do if your commanding officer asked how many prisoners you had, and your honest answer was, "Don't worry, we're going to have some more in a little while," and then you meant it literally for the rest of the afternoon? And what happens to a man built for exactly one purpose, killing the enemy without hesitation, once the war that needed him is finally over? By the end of a single November afternoon in 1944, a staff sergeant from the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia had personally killed or captured roughly 45 German soldiers in one small French village, alone without orders, armed with whatever weapon he happened to pick up next. We'll show you exactly how that afternoon unfolded in a moment. First, you need to understand who this man actually was, and why the answer is far stranger and more human than the legend that grew around him. They called him a one-man army. His own officers called him barely controllable. Both things were true at the same time. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Junior J. Spurrier. The threat by the autumn of 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army was driving hard through the Lorraine region of northeastern France, pushing toward the German border along the Saar River Valley. The 35th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Santa Fe Division, had been leading that advance for days, clearing one small French village after another, each one a potential strong point where retreating German forces could dig in and slow the American advance with machine guns, mortars, and the kind of prepared defensive positions that turned narrow village streets into deadly killing zones. Among the ranks of the 134th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion was a staff sergeant named Junior J. Spurrier, a squad leader whose reputation among his fellow soldiers had already become something close to legendary by the time his unit approached the village of Achain on November 13th, 1944. Spurrier had grown up in grinding poverty in rural Virginia during the Great Depression, enlisted underage by lying about his birth date, and found in combat something that seemed to fit him in a way almost nothing else in his life ever had. He was, in the blunt assessment of his own company commander, a soldier who thrived on the adrenaline of close-quarters combat in a way that bordered on recklessness, a man who volunteered for every dangerous mission available, and frequently wandered off from his own squad simply to find more Germans to fight alone. Achain had been described to the battalion commander, Major Frederick Roker, as lightly defended. As companies F and G of the 2nd Battalion advanced across more than 1,500 yards of open terrain toward the village, that assessment proved badly wrong. German defenders opened up with a violent barrage of rifle and automatic weapons, fire that pinned Company F down in a nearby orchard, and forced Company G to maneuver around the town's eastern flank. For reasons that were never fully explained in any official record, Staff Sergeant Spurrier made a decision entirely his own. He would attack the town from the west, alone. The broader context of the 35th Infantry Division's campaign through Lorraine helps explain why a moment like this was even possible within the structure of American infantry doctrine. For 6 consecutive days leading up to the fight at Achain, the division had spearheaded Patton's advance up the Saar River Valley, clearing town after town in a grinding, exhausting campaign that left units perpetually under strength and officers stretched thin trying to maintain control over exhausted men. In an army built around independent initiative at every level, from squad leader on up, a soldier like Spurrier, aggressive to the point of recklessness and genuinely unafraid of operating without orders, was not entirely an aberration. He was, in some sense, an extreme expression of exactly the quality American infantry training was designed to produce, taken to a degree that even his own officers found difficult to fully control. The secret development: there was no secret weapon waiting for Spurrier that afternoon. What there was, instead, was a single soldier's willingness to keep finding a new weapon every time the last one ran dry, and a village full of German defenders who had no idea they were about to be attacked by a force of exactly one man. Working his way alone across the open field toward Achain, Spurrier stumbled directly into a German outpost near the Orchard Sheltering Company F. Before the German soldiers could react, he killed 2 of them and sent the rest fleeing. He continued into the village itself, where he found the streets filled with German troops still setting up their defense. Using his Browning automatic rifle, Spurrier began systematically clearing enemy strongpoints, killing several Germans outright and taking 6 prisoners in his opening minutes inside the town. As Companies E and G fought their way into the eastern edge of Achain and established a battalion command post, the sound of sustained automatic weapons fired drew the attention of the battalion's operations officer, First Lieutenant Burr Sutter. He asked who was doing all that firing. The answer came back immediately from the men in the command post. It was Spurrier. He was, one soldier told Sutter, a regular one-man army. Spurrier had taken up a firing position in a second-floor window of the very building that had become Company E's command post, pouring magazine after magazine of BAR fire into nearby German positions, while enemy rounds splattered the concrete around his window. A few minutes later, he strolled casually into the battalion command post itself and asked Lieutenant Abraham Berkson, the battalion intelligence officer, a simple question. How many prisoners did they have? Berkson told him 6. Spurrier's response left no ambiguity about his intentions for the rest of the afternoon. "Don't worry, Lieutenant," he said. "We are going to have some more in a little while." That exchange, small and almost conversational in tone, captures something essential about how Spurrier's fellow soldiers experienced him in the middle of active combat. He did not treat the fighting as an emergency to be endured. He treated it, by every surviving account from the men who served alongside him, as something closer to his natural working environment, a task he approached with the same casual confidence another man might bring to a familiar job. Lieutenant Sutter's own reaction to hearing the sustained BAR fire, a grim nod rather than alarm, suggests that by this point in the campaign, Spurrier's solo engagements had become something the battalion had simply come to expect from him. However unconventional they remained by any formal standard of infantry tactics. Technical supremacy: there is no chapter in this story about superior American weaponry, because Spurrier's technical arsenal that afternoon consisted of literally whatever he could get his hands on next. One weapon after another, discarded the moment it ran empty or jammed. He climbed onto a table beneath a rear window and fired his BAR through it into a building across the street until the weapon jammed. He swapped it for another soldier's BAR and kept firing until that one ran out of ammunition too. He picked up an M1 rifle and fired that at the same target. When an enemy sniper's automatic burst nearly hit him, witnesses said the near miss visibly angered him, and Spurrier responded by grabbing a captured German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon and firing it directly into the building sheltering the sniper. He found 2 more Panzerfausts nearby and fired those into the same target as well. Still not satisfied, he located an American bazooka and put 3 additional rockets into the building. Moments later, flames were pouring from its windows, and a coughing German captain, his lieutenant, and 14 enlisted men stumbled out with their hands raised. Spurrier marched all 16 prisoners back to Lieutenant Berkson, delivering them with a characteristically understated line. "Here you go, Lieutenant." He was not finished. Warned by nearby riflemen about a sniper in a building further up the street, Spurrier moved from doorway to doorway under continued fire, pulled a grenade from his jacket, and threw it through an open window, followed immediately by 2 more. When the smoke cleared, 2 Germans staggered out with their hands up. Mop-up troops later found 3 more dead inside. For the remainder of the afternoon, Spurrier continued roaming the village alone, taking prisoners and killing German soldiers wherever he found them. By the time Major Roker placed him in charge of the outposts being set up around the town's perimeter as darkness fell, Spurrier had already accumulated a tally that, according to the officers who tried to keep count, ran to roughly 20 prisoners, and as many as 25 German soldiers killed in a single day, entirely on his own initiative, with no orders directing any of it. Even after dark, with outposts established and the fighting seemingly winding down, Spurrier did not stop working. Inspecting the perimeter positions he had been assigned to oversee, he heard German voices coming from inside a nearby barn. Rather than calling for reinforcement, he crept up alone, set fire to a pile of hay inside, and captured 4 more German soldiers as they scrambled out through the smoke to escape the flames. Moving on to check another outpost shortly afterward, he spotted a shadowy figure crawling toward an unaware American sentry. Spurrier issued a challenge. When the figure failed to respond, he shot and killed what turned out to be yet another enemy soldier attempting to infiltrate the American line under cover of darkness. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary single day's work, and it did not end until well after the sun had gone down. The global impact the fight for Achain came at a real cost. The already understrength 2nd Battalion suffered 106 casualties that day, including the loss of every officer in Company F, with another 50 men evacuated due to exposure in the cold, wet November weather. But by late afternoon, roughly 2/3 of the village had been cleared, and the momentum of Patton's Third Army continued its push through Lorraine largely uninterrupted, with Achain becoming just one more cleared objective in a campaign that depended, town by town, on exactly this kind of aggressive, often costly forward pressure. Spurrier's actions that day were not an isolated incident in his combat record. 2 months earlier, near the village of Les Saint-Christophe outside Nancy, he had climbed aboard an exposed tank destroyer under heavy fire, manned its .50 caliber machine gun, and repeatedly leapt down to personally assault German bunkers with grenades and rifle fire when the defenders refused to surrender. A single day's action that alone resulted in over a dozen German dead and 22 additional prisoners, and earned him a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. When his company commander and platoon leader compared notes on both engagements, they agreed his actions at Achain warranted something more. Rather than the Distinguished Service Cross already in process, Major Roker put Spurrier forward for the Medal of Honor itself. The contrast between these 2 engagements, separated by exactly 2 months, illustrates something important about how Spurrier's superiors came to understand him over time. The action near Nancy in September had already marked him as an exceptional soldier, aggressive and effective well beyond what his rank and role required. But it was the sheer scale and duration of what happened at Achain, an entire afternoon of sustained, self-directed combat across an entire village rather than a single concentrated assault, that finally convinced his chain of command they were looking at something beyond even an unusually brave infantryman. Lieutenant Davis's simple assessment, delivered to Major Roker in the days after the battle, that Spurrier deserved the nation's highest award for valor, reflected a judgment that had been building for months, finally crystallized by one village and one impossibly long afternoon of fighting. On March 9th, 1945, at 9th Army Headquarters in the captured German city of Gelsenkirchen, Lieutenant General William H. Simpson draped the Medal of Honor around Spurrier's neck. The Army, eager for a morale-boosting story in the war's final months, paraded him in front of newsmen from Germany to Paris, branding him publicly as the one-man army and task force Spurrier. It was, by every measure of formal military recognition, an extraordinary validation of a single soldier's battlefield courage. The timing and framing of that recognition mattered enormously to an army looking for exactly this kind of story as the war in Europe entered its final, grinding months. By early 1945, American newspapers had spent years covering a war that, for all its eventual triumphs, had also delivered a steady stream of grim casualty reports and hard-fought, costly campaigns. A single soldier who had, on two separate occasions, personally accounted for dozens of enemy casualties and dozens more prisoners through sheer individual initiative, offered exactly the kind of vivid, easily told narrative that military public affairs officers were eager to promote. Spurrier's press tour, stretching from the front lines in Germany to celebratory appearances in Paris, transformed a Virginia sharecropper's son into a household name across the American press for a brief, intense period in the final weeks of the European War. Conclusion: what happened to Junior Spurrier after the medal ceremony is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the shorter, more triumphant retellings, and it is worth telling honestly, because it says something true about the cost combat can extract even from the men it makes legendary. His own battalion commanders had already noted, well before Achain, that Spurrier abhorred responsibility, often abandoned his own squad to hunt Germans alone, and spent his time away from combat searching for alcohol. After receiving the Medal of Honor, that pattern did not improve. A later battalion commander, Major Carlisle McDaniel, believed Spurrier should have faced court-martial for his conduct, and in the war's final weeks, Spurrier stole a command vehicle, got drunk, and barricaded himself in a German farmhouse, threatening his own commanding officer with his weapon before the war ended, and the charges quietly disappeared. The years that followed were no easier. A failed auto repair business, a broken marriage, financial fraud charges, a prison sentence eventually commuted by the governor of West Virginia, and decades of struggling with alcohol and what would today be immediately recognized as the psychological wounds of sustained, extreme combat exposure. In a 1980 interview, confined by then to a wheelchair with arthritis, Spurrier reflected on the medal that had made him briefly famous with a plainness that cuts through all the wartime mythology. He did not regret having it, he said. A man would have to be stupid not to want it. But he had never tried to get one, and there were times he wished he didn't have it because of how much people expected from him afterward. He died in 1984, and his headstone at Mountain Home National Cemetery in Tennessee lists the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, a Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts, an extraordinary record of valor, attached to a man whose life after the war reminds us that the same qualities that made someone unstoppable on a battlefield in France did not necessarily translate into an easy peace once the guns finally fell silent. There is a version of Junior Spurrier's story that stops at the medal ceremony in Gelsenkirchen, and it is, understandably, the version most often told, because it is the cleaner story, the one that fits neatly into a narrative of pure heroism rewarded. But the fuller record, including the court-martial he narrowly avoided, the re-enlistments that ended in more trouble, and the decades of quiet struggle that followed his return home, offers something more honest and, in its own way, more valuable. It suggests that the qualities that made Spurrier extraordinary on a battlefield in Lorraine, an almost total absence of fear, an eagerness to face danger that other men instinctively avoided, a comfort with violence that verged on the compulsive, were not qualities that simply switched off when the fighting stopped. They were part of who he was, and they came at a cost that both the army and the country that celebrated him were considerably less prepared to help him carry once the war that had given those qualities their purpose was finally over.